All right, people, we are going to look at Unit 2, multiple choice and free response from microeconomics. There's a lot of elasticity stuff in here, producer and consumer surplus, some deadweight loss. As always, I would encourage you to pause the video at the beginning of each question to read it, write down an answer choice, and then unpause and listen to the correct answer and the explanation, and see what you did wrong, see what you did correctly, and see how many of these 27 you can get correct. Okay. Number one, I'm going to go quick, so I'm expecting you to pause this in between each question. Number one, you have an increase in the price of good X, which causes buyers to want to buy more of good Y. So the price of good X goes up, fewer people buy X, more people buy Y. So you know that these two goods must be substitutes, and the demand curve for good Y must shift to the right. So your answer for number one should be B. Okay, number two, which of the following correctly describes the income effect associated with the law of demand? So the income effect essentially says that as the price goes down, your purchasing power increases, right? So even if your income stays the same, your real income changes when the price of something changes. So on number two, the income effect here, your answer would be E. If the price of a normal good goes down, the purchasing power of consumers' income goes up, so your real income would rise. Therefore, consumers would be willing and able to purchase more of the goods. So that's kind of the definition of the income effect. Okay, number three. A change in which of the following causes a movement along a given demand curve for a normal good? The only thing which causes a movement along the curve is a change in the price. A change in anything else is going to shift the entire curve. Okay, so your answer here, what causes a movement along a demand curve? That would be a change in the price of the good in question. Answer choice C. Okay, number four. Which of the following will occur as a result of a decrease in the prices of inputs used to produce a good? Okay, which of the following would occur as a result of a decrease in the price of inputs used to produce a good? So if you draw the supply and demand curve, if there's a decrease in the price of inputs, that's going to increase the supply, or the supply curve will shift to the right. Okay, when the supply curve shifts to the right, your answer should be A, that the quantity supplied would increase at each possible price. That is what happens when the supply curve shifts, is that the quantity supplied changes at every single price point, okay? So number four, your answer should be A. Number five, which of the following explains why the supply curve is upward sloping? So why is your supply curve upward sloping? Why is there a positive relationship there between the price and the quantity supplied? So your answer here should be E, that at a higher price, when the price of something goes up, producers are more able to cover the higher marginal cost associated with increasing production. So you don't have a constant marginal cost whenever you produce something, right? So on Tuesday, we're going to look at cost curves. Your marginal cost looks like a Nike swoosh. It goes down initially, then it goes up. Okay, again, and so, you know, I've mentioned this a couple of times during these Zoom sessions, but this again is an argument against price gouging laws, that if you don't allow prices to go up, some firms just can't produce more. So they have no incentive to do so because they can't charge a higher price, but they also just can't because they don't have constant production costs. Those costs to produce go up, marginal costs rise, right? As firms start to produce more and more of something, the additional cost to produce one more goes up, then to produce the next one goes up, and there's more and more competition for those inputs which are used in the production process. And so when you allow the price to rise, it enables firms to produce more. They have an incentive to produce more because of the profit motive, but also it enables them to produce more, enables them to increase their additional revenue to match or exceed that marginal cost. So your answer for number five should be E, that at a higher price, producers are more able to cover the increase in the marginal cost. Okay. Number six, the market supply curve for a product is derived from the individual firm supply curve. So it's The overall market supply is a combination of all of the individual supply curves of all of the firms. So it's adding up all of the quantities that each producer is willing and able to sell. So your answer for 6 should be D. Okay, number 7. So the next couple, you're going to have to do a little bit of math. Okay, this says you have a 10% increase in the price of a good, and that results in a 4% increase in total revenue. So the price of a good goes up, and the total revenue generated by selling the good also goes up. So if your price and total revenue change in the same direction, you know that the good must be inelastic. That's the total revenue test. Okay, so total revenue test says if there's a change in price and total revenue changes in the same direction, it is inelastic. So again, you just think about insulin. If the price of insulin goes up 10%, the revenue generated by selling insulin is probably also going to go up by 10%, right? And so an inelastic good, price and total revenue travel in the same direction. If it is elastic, they'll go in opposite directions. The price goes up 5% and everybody stops buying it, or very price sensitive, so you have like a 30% drop in the quantity demanded. Okay, so your answer should be that it is inelastic. Answer choice B. And again, we know that because of the total revenue test. Okay, look at number 8. So number 8, it says a firm estimates that the absolute value of the price elasticity of demand. So the fact that they say absolute value isn't really relevant here. Okay, we always take absolute value with elasticity of demand because there's an inverse relationship between change in the price and change in quantity demanded. And so your number is always going to be negative, right? And so when you're doing the coefficient test to determine if it's elastic or inelastic, we always take absolute value. If it's greater than 1, it's elastic. Less than 1, it's inelastic. Okay, so let's keep going. It says absolute value of price elasticity of demand is 2. So it's greater than 1. That means we know it is elastic. The firm increases its sandwich price by 10%. What happens to the quantity demanded? So the way we find this is the coefficient test. Okay, so your elasticity coefficient is the change in the percent change in quantity over the percent change in price. Okay, so queens over peasants, or however, whatever stupid way you want to remember it. Percent change in quantity over the percent change in price. So your denominator is 10. It's going to equal, your coefficient equals 2. So it's x over 10 equals 2, which I know is super high level, one-step algebra. Your answer there would be a 20% change. The price goes up. That means that the quantity demanded goes down. That's just the law of demand. So your answer for number 8, should be that the quantity demanded is going to fall by 20%. It's going to fall by 20%. So number 8, your answer should be D. Okay, price goes up 10%, quantity demanded falls by 20%. Okay. Okay, number 9. So this says, which of the following statements is true about the demand curve above? This is kind of a weird question, right? Because it's hard to calculate the elasticity between these 2 points because we don't really know what this is. It looks like it's $3. I guess we could assume that. This looks like 6, but again, we don't really know. That looks like 2, and that looks like 1. So you can use those numbers to calculate if you want to. But the general idea with elasticity here, and the way I would steer you to think about this question, is when your income or when the price of something goes up, the more expensive a good, generally speaking, the more expensive a good, the more elastic the demand for the good. So if you take 2 goods, if you take a car that's $30,000 and you take a bag of chips that's $2, okay, if you have a 100% increase in the price of both, that car isn't $30,000, it's $60,000. So no one's going to buy that car anymore, right? The higher the price, the more elastic or the more sensitive we are to the price change. Whereas with a bag of chips, it goes from $1 to $2 and whatever, it's only $2, right? And so the higher the price, the more elastic the demand. And so your answer here is that the elasticity decreases, or it becomes more inelastic when the price falls from point X to point Y. Okay, so your answer for number 9 should be B. That as you move from X to Y, as the price goes down, it gets smaller and smaller. It becomes a smaller and smaller portion of your income. Therefore, we're going to be less responsive to a price change. Okay, so number 9 is B. Okay, number 10 says, which of the following would cause the supply of good X to become more elastic? So I'll be honest, when I first read this question, I said, oh, well, it's A. The reason why it's not A is because I'm an idiot and it doesn't say demand, it says supply, right? So if that word said demand, your answer would be A, but it doesn't, it says supply. So what would make the supply more elastic, or what would result in firms being more sensitive to a price change? And so your answer for number 10 should be C. Firms are going to be more sensitive to a price change if they can easily reallocate resources away from producing something towards producing this good, the good in question, okay, good X. All right. So the easier that the ease with which firms can reallocate resources and the speed with which they can do so impacts elasticity. The quicker they're able to adjust, the more elastic the supply of the good. Okay. Number 11. All right, number 11, you got to do a little bit of math here. It says, which of the following is true about the supply curve between the given points? It gives you prices, it gives you quantities supplied. And so this is just your percent change in quantity over your percent change in price. So if your new is here and if your new is $20.60 and your old is $10.50, your elasticity of supply, let's do percent change in quantity first. You'd have your new minus your old over your old. So 10 over 50 or 1 over 5. So I'd say 20% change in the quantity. Okay, so that's your numerator. Your denominator, new minus old over old. So 20 minus 10 over 10. 10 over 10, that's a 100% change. So you have 20 over 100, 2 over 10, 1 over 5. Okay, and so you have an elasticity of 0.2. Okay, so on number 11, your answer should be A, that the supply curve is inelastic because the percent change in the price, 100%, is greater than the percent change in the quantity supplied, which is 20%. Okay, so there's a greater change in quantity than change in price, indicating that firms are sensitive to the price change given these numbers, okay, or are insensitive to the price change because there's a smaller change in quantity than the change in price. Okay, number 12. The price elasticity for supply of gasoline in the short run is 0.4. Okay, it's 0.4. Due to an unexpected surge in the demand for gasoline, the price of gasoline jumps by 20%. As a result, the quantity supplied of gasoline will do what? So this is just math. Percent change in quantity over percent change in price equals 0.4. Okay, so the percent change in price is 20. So it is X over 20 equals 0.4, okay? Or the change in quantity over the change in price, so the change in quantity over 20 equals 0.4. So your answer for 12 should be C. 8 over 20 is 4 over 10, which is 0.4, okay? So a little bit of math on that one, okay? Number 13. Okay, it says, which of the following is true about good J? So you have a lot of information over here. Which of the following is true? So your answer here is C, that good J is an inferior good. Your income elasticity is the percent change in quantity when there's a change in your income. And so if you have a negative coefficient here, if you have a negative number when you calculate the income elasticity, that means that your income went up and you bought less of this thing, which means that as your income rises, you don't want to buy that garbage good anymore, right? So it must be an inferior good, okay? So 13 is C. There's a lot of stuff in here. Cross-price elasticity of X, Y, and Z. The price elasticity is 0.75, income elasticity. So they give you a lot of different stuff. You just got to weed through it and figure out which one works here, okay? Look at 14. So it's the same numbers, right? It's the exact same table. And it says, which of the following would result in the greatest rightward shift of the demand for good J? So this one's a little bit tricky here, okay? Because you do have to do some math in order to figure this out. So first of all, price elasticity is elasticity of demand, which is 0.75. That means that it's smaller than 1, indicating that this good exhibits inelastic demand, okay? The next 3 are cross-price elasticity. So this is trying to determine, is a good a complement or substitute? Okay, so it's the percent change in the quantity of good A when there's a change in the price of good B. Okay, if those numbers are positive, it means that the price of good A goes up, you stop buying it, and instead you buy more of good B. So if you have a positive cross price elasticity coefficient, I'm going to say that again. If you have a positive cross price elasticity coefficient, the goods are substitutes. That means that the price goes up and you buy more of the other thing. That means you substituted from the more expensive good, the good which is now more expensive, to the other good. If there's a negative, so you know X and Y are substitutes of good J. If you get a negative coefficient like you do with good Z, it means that the price of good J goes up, you stop buying it, and you stop buying good Z. So you would get a negative coefficient there. So if you get a negative coefficient, the goods are complementary goods. Okay, then income elasticity is what we did on number 13. If it's negative, it's an inferior good. Positive, it's a normal good. Okay, so what's going to cause the greatest rightward shift of the demand curve for good J? So what's tricky here is your answer is either B or C. Okay, it's not D because an increase in the price of good Z, remember these are good Z and good J are complementary goods because we know that because of the negative coefficient. So if the price of good Z goes up, that's going to result in a shift to the left of good J. You're going to buy less of good J because you're buying less of good Z because the price of good Z went up, right? So your answer is either an increase in the price of X, so you buy more of J, or an increase in the good of Y, so you buy more of J. So the question is asking which results in the greatest shift to the right of good J. And here's where you got to do a little bit of math, okay? So first, if you look at good X, okay, if you look at good X, if you have a coefficient of 0.8, that means that when there is a, it means that when there is a 20% change in the price, that means in order to get the coefficient of 0.8, there must be a 16% change in the quantity demanded. So there's a 16% change of good J when there's a 20% change in the price of good X. Okay, so 16%. And if you look at C, it says there's a 10% increase in the price of good Y. The coefficient is 2, which means it would have to be 20% over 10%. So which has a greater impact on good J? Good X would have a 16% change, and good Y would have a 20% change. So your answer should be C. Okay, so your answer for number 14 should be C. There's a lot of stuff in there. I know I just spent like 6 minutes talking about this one question. But your answer there would be C because that would result in a 20% change in the demand of good J as opposed to a 16% change in the demand of good J with good X. Okay. Number 15. Okay, number 15. More math. Great. At the current prices of goods X and Y, the quantity demanded of good X is 10. The quantity demanded of good Y is 5. The cross price elasticity between the two goods is 0.6. So it's positive. So does that mean they're complements or substitutes? Think about that last question. If there is a positive cross price elasticity coefficient, that means they're substitute goods, right? That means the price goes up and you buy more of the other. So you have a positive relationship. They're positive over positive, so they must be substitute goods. So you have a 10% increase in the price of good Y. Fewer people will buy good Y, but more people would buy good X. How many more? Well, X over 10 equals 0.6. So you're going to have a 6% increase in the quantity demand of good X. So you'd have positive 6 over positive 10 equals positive 0.6. So 15 is D. Okay, 16. Cool, we get away from math for a little bit, and this one's a softball. So it says in the market described in the diagram above, the total economic surplus will be maximized where? Where is your total surplus maximized? This is where the sum of your consumer and producer surplus are maximized. That's if you have no deadweight loss, and you'll have no deadweight loss at the equilibrium point of P2 and Q2. So your answer for 16 should be C. Okay, number 17. Back to some math here. Okay, this says the table above shows the supply and demand schedules in the orange market. Assume the demand and supply curves are linear. At the market equilibrium price, what are the consumer surplus and producer surplus? I don't think this is very difficult. What makes it seem difficult is that you don't have a graph to look at, right? If you look at the graph, you would see Oh yeah, consumer surplus is area of that triangle, producer surplus the area of that triangle, and you could find it by doing base times height over 2. You don't have that triangle here. So the first thing I'd have you do is identify what is the market equilibrium price. So we know that. It's also called the market clearing price. So the equilibrium price is where the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded, which is at $10. That's where the quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. So at $10, what is your consumer surplus? What is your producer surplus? So what I would tell you to do here is graph this, okay? So graph the supply and demand, put the numbers on the y-axis and the x-axis, and calculate, okay? If you do that, it's really not that complicated. So let me show you the key here. So this is what it would look like if you graphed it, okay? You would have the market clearing price of $10, okay? At a price of 0, we want the quantity demanded is 20, quantity supplied is 0. And at a price of 20, the quantity supplied is 20, quantity demanded is 0. So we just take those numbers from the data box up here and we apply it to the graph down here that we draw. So once you have this, it should be super easy. That your consumer surplus is the area of this triangle. It is your base of 10 times your height of 10, so 100 divided by 2, so 50. And your producer surplus is your base of 10 times your height of 10 divided by 2, so also 50. So you have a consumer surplus of 50 and a producer surplus of 50. Okay, so C. All right, number 18. The market for tomatoes is in equilibrium at a price of $10 and quantity of 50. If consumer surplus is 400 and total surplus is 650, what's the producer surplus? Okay, so this is arithmetic. If total surplus is 650, total surplus is consumer plus producer, okay? So if your total surplus, let me make sure we're still going here. Yeah, we are, okay. If your total surplus is 650 and your consumer surplus is 400, that means your producer surplus must be 250. So that one's very straightforward. That one's pretty easy, okay? Number 19. Consider the market for arugula, a normal good. Which of the following changes would result in an increase in the price and quantity of arugula? So think about your supply and demand graph. What would result in an increase in the price and quantity? So let's start with supply. If you increase supply, you have a lower price and a greater quantity, so that's not it. If you decrease supply, you have a higher price, but a lower quantity, so that's not it. Okay, so think about demand. If you decrease demand, price goes down, quantity goes down, so that's not it. If you increase demand, price goes up and quantity goes up. So it has to be an increase in demand. So which of these 5 result in an increase in the demand? That would be an increase in population. If we have more people, there are more people buying it. Okay, so that's number 19E. Number 20. Which of the following will initially result from an increase in the market demand for a good? Okay, so this one is interesting because we usually think about the market immediately changing to equilibrium, but in reality, that's not what happens, right? So think about what happened right at the beginning stages of coronavirus in the United States. What happened initially? Well, initially there was a dramatic increase in the demand for hand sanitizer, right? That was the big one initially. Then it was toilet paper. So there's an increase in hand sanitizer. Well, what happened immediately was there's a shortage, right? If the market was allowed to adjust on its own and there weren't price gouging laws, then the supply would have pretty quickly caught up to that, and it would have we would have equilibrated, lowering the price and increasing the quantity available. But what happens initially is you do have that shortage, and it takes a second for the market to catch up. But as long as you allow the market to do its thing, the market would correct itself relatively quickly because of those price signals. So your answer there should be, for number 20 is D, is there's a temporary shortage at the original equilibrium price. When the price rises, if the price is allowed to rise, then we would pretty quickly arrive at that new equilibrium. So number 20, your answer should be D. Okay, 21. Assume that the market for a good is characterized by a downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply, so normal curves. There's an improvement in technology for producing the good. Which of the following would occur? So your answer for 21 should be C, that the total surplus is going to increase. So if you draw your supply and demand graph, this should be pretty easy too. If you just draw your supply and demand graph and you see your consumer surplus and producer surplus, if there's an increase in the supply, you can see now that there's a lower price, all consumers who are buying the good initially have a greater surplus, and there are now more consumers willing and able to buy at this lower price. So consumer surplus definitely grows. Producer surplus is going to shrink for some because they were selling it at a higher price, but it's going to increase for some as well because they're able to sell more than they were before, right? And so your answer for 21 is that the total surplus is definitely going to increase. Answer choice C. And again, not something you have to memorize. Draw the graph, look at the surplus, show a shift, look at your new surplus, and it should be pretty clear. 22, which of the following policies would result in an increase in the quantity supplied? An increase in the quantity supplied. Okay, so this is a movement along the supply curve, all right? So your answer for 22 should be C, which is imposing a binding price floor. So this is just changing the price, right? If a price floor is imposed, a binding price floor, remember, for a price floor to be effective, it has to be set above equilibrium. So the government sets the price artificially high, and when that price rises, the quantity supplied rises, and the quantity demanded decreases. Now we have a surplus, right? But the point is that binding price floor set above equilibrium results in an increase in the quantity supplied. So 22, your answer should be C. Okay, 23. Which of the following cases would government intervention in a market result in an increase in the quantity sold? An increase in the quantity sold. So this is moving from an original equilibrium quantity to further to the right on the x-axis. Your answer here should be E, providing producers of a product with a per unit subsidy. So think about what a subsidy does. A per unit subsidy is essentially lowering the marginal cost of production by the amount of the subsidy, right? If you give me a $1 per unit subsidy, that basically lowers my production price by $1 per unit because each unit that I sell, I get that extra dollar, okay? Hope that makes sense. And so what's happening is you're driving those marginal costs down by the amount of the per unit subsidy, which is essentially increasing the supply or shifting the supply curve to the right. Remember, your marginal cost above ABC is your supply curve, okay? So when you make it cheaper for the firm or more profitable for the firm to produce, it increases the supply. So from your original supply and demand, you increase the supply, and that's going to increase the equilibrium quantity, okay? So answer choice E. Okay, number 24. Says, assume the market for a good is in equilibrium, 20 bucks, quantity of 100. The government imposes a $5 per unit excise tax. Think about what that's going to shift. You have your supply and demand, $20 on the y-axis, 100 on the x-axis. Now there's a $5 excise tax. That means that the supply curve shifts to the left. Okay, the supply curve shifts to the left. Okay, the price buyers pay for the good goes up by $3. So of that $5 tax, we're paying $3 and producers are paying $2. So which of the following are possible values for the government tax revenue and deadweight loss in the market? So possible tax revenue and possible deadweight loss. You don't have enough information to know exactly what the tax revenue is or the deadweight loss because they don't tell you the change in quantity. But what you do know are the possible values of tax revenue and deadweight loss. If there is an excise tax placed on a good, there will be deadweight loss unless you're doing this to correct an externality, which you're not here, or otherwise they would have said so. So you definitely have deadweight loss. So it's not A and it's not B, okay? The tax revenue, this says 500 and 500. No, it can't be 500. Think about it. The excise tax is $5. The quantity we were buying before the tax was 100. Now that we have that tax, we're certainly going to be buying less. We know it's not perfectly inelastic because we're not paying for all of the tax. And so the tax revenue can't be $500 because that would imply that we're still buying 100 units with that $5 tax. So that's not happening, right? So it's not D, it's not E, it's not A or B because we know there has to be some deadweight loss. C seems plausible, right? That there is some tax revenue based on this, the quantity demanded fell to 60. Deadweight loss is 100, which also seems plausible. That would be 1/2 base times height. That would be the change in your on the x-axis then would be 40. Half of that would be 20, and your vertical distance would be 50. or 5 rather, which is the amount of the tax. So those numbers match up. So it's difficult to answer this because you don't have the quantities on there, but there's only one that makes sense where the math works, and that's answer choice C. So you kind of have to attack that with process of elimination. Okay, 25. The graph above shows the domestic market for sandalwood at equilibrium at a price of 800 in the absence of international trade, no trade. Now assume the country begins to engage in international trade and sandalwood is selling at a price of $600 in the world market. Which of the following would most likely result? Okay, so now that the price falls to 600, you can see a couple things, right? The quantity demanded goes from Q2 to Q3, but the quantity which domestic firms are willing to supply goes from Q2 to Q1. And so we're going to buy Q3 at $600. That's what we're going to buy. We're able to get Q1 domestically, which means that we're going to import the difference, Q3 minus Q1, okay? So your answer for number 25, the answer that makes sense here is E, that the total surplus is going to increase. We know that because it was just F for us and G and H for producers. After we open up trade, now it's F, G, J, and K for consumers and H for producers. So consumer surplus grows by G, J, K. Producer surplus shrinks from G, H to just H, but there is more surplus, J and K. There's more surplus than before, right? We added J and K. Consumers got it, and consumers took G away from the producers, essentially. The total surplus definitely increases. And going back to answer choice E, the domestic consumer surplus increases for sure by more than the domestic producer surplus decreases. Yeah. So basically it's saying that the consumer surplus grows more than the producer surplus shrinks, right? So the net result is an increase in total surplus. So answer choice E. Okay, 26. Suppose the small country of whatever that is, Aranau, imports 40,000 kilograms of bananas. That's a lot of bananas. The global price of bananas is 50 cents per kilogram. The government of Aranau collects tariff revenues of $4,000 from banana imports. Okay, so the tariff revenue is $4,000, and we're importing 40,000. So the 50 cents, so first of all, let's figure out the amount of the tariff, right? The amount of the tariff is the quantity we're importing divided by the revenue. So if it was $1, then it'd be 40,000. So it must be 10 cents, right? So a 10 cent tariff on 40,000 kilograms would result in a revenue of 4,000. So we have a 10 cent tariff, and the global price is 50, which means when people of Aranau buy a kilogram of bananas, it costs them 50 cents and the 10 cent tariff price as well, which means that consumers are actually paying that 60 cent per kilogram of bananas. 50 cents because that's the world price plus the 10 cent tariff. Okay, last question on the multiple choice. It says the table show the domestic demand and domestic supply for two small countries participating in a large global market with the world price of coffee equal to $3. So what do you know? Let's look at country A, price of $3. The quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied, which means they must be importing. So they're importing 20 units. Okay, let's look at country B. At a price of $3, the quantity demanded is 5 and the quantity supplied is 15. So country B is exporting their extra 10 units. Country Y is importing 20 units. So they could presumably import 10 from country B and 10 from some other country. It does tell us that it's two small countries participating in a large global market. So you know that country A is importing some and country B is exporting some. That's what you know. So on 27, your answer would be C. Country A is going to import 20 units of coffee and country B would export 10. Okay. What I encourage you to do is go back through these questions. If all you did, and let's be honest, most of you didn't pause the video, you just listened to the explanations as we went. What I'd encourage you to do, if that was you, is go back, so start this over and go back through them. And if you don't want to pause it, fine. But I'm going fast because I'm hoping you are pausing and actually doing these on your own. So go back and watch all this through again. If there are any that were confusing, go back and listen to the explanation again. Listen to it 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times until it sinks in. And if it never sinks in, then I'd look at AC/DC economics, I type in ACDC Econ Unit 2 Micro or ACDC Econ Excise Tax, ACDC Econ World Trade, something like that, and you'll find a good video from Jacob Clifford on that stuff. So I'm going to pause the video and I'm going to go get a drink of water, and then I'll be back and we'll do the free response. All right, people. So we have 2 free response questions here. The first one, it says, so they give us a graph here, supply and demand graph. It says, assume that sugar-based soft drinks are produced in a market shown on the graph above. Answer the following questions based on the information given in the graph. Okay, so it says to reduce the consumption of sugary soft drinks, suppose the government imposed a $2 per unit sales tax on soft drinks. First of all, thank goodness this government is cracking down on the consumption of sugary soft drinks. How the heck else would we maintain a healthy population? We need the government to save us from ourselves and make these decisions on our behalf. Thank goodness they're doing this for us. Otherwise, we'd all die of obesity. So what's going to happen with the $2 per unit sales tax? Well, that's going to shift the supply curve to the left, okay, to the point at which the vertical distance between your original supply curve and your new supply curve is the amount of the tariff, so is $2, okay? So the first question says, will the price of soft drinks go up by the full amount of the sales tax? Well, if you were to show the shift in the supply curve, it would shift to the point at which your vertical distance is equal to $2. And so it would run through, your new equilibrium price would be $6, right? Your supply curve would be here. It would be parallel to your original supply curve. Exactly $2 higher than the original supply curve. So it's going to run through $6. So your new equilibrium price would be $6 if you were to draw this. And so did it rise by the full $2? The answer is no, it didn't. We were paying $5, now we're paying $6, okay? It does ask you to explain, so that's what I would say. I would say we were paying $5, the new equilibrium price is $6, therefore no, it did not go up by the full amount of the tax. Okay, number A2. Calculate the tax revenue the government can collect from the sale of the soft drinks. So it's going to be the $2 tax times the quantity. So $2, the new quantity at your equilibrium is 4 million cases. And so it would be $8 million. Okay, so $8 million bucks. Number 3, A3. Will the consumer surplus go up or down or stay the same after the tax? Pretty intuitive here that it costs us more money, so our surplus is going to shrink. So it's going to shrink for 2 reasons. You have 2 groups of consumers. For one group of consumers, they were willing to pay $5.50, so they were going to buy it at $5. They're not going to buy it at $6. So for them, the people along the demand curve from $6 down to $5, they're out of the market, right? They're gone. Okay, you priced them out of the market. And for the other consumers, those who were willing to pay $8, they had a surplus of 3. Now they only have a surplus of 2, right? So the consumer surplus shrinks without a doubt. It does not ask for an explanation, so you just say decrease. A4, calculate the deadweight loss. So your deadweight loss, your new supply curve runs through this point. So your deadweight loss is going to be this triangle from 6 down to 4 over to your old equilibrium point. So your base of 1 times your height of 2 would be 2, divided by 2 is 1. So $1 million would be the amount of the deadweight loss, okay? If you were to draw this graph, it should look like this, right? Hopefully you can see that right here, where my cursor is down here. Your supply curve is right here. After the imposition of the tax, it shifts to the left, running through, so your new equilibrium point is $6 at a quantity of 4. This right here is the change in the consumer surplus, okay? It was the entire triangle all the way down to the original supply curve, and now it's down to the new supply curve. So that trapezoid is the lost consumer surplus. And then your deadweight loss is 6 down to 4 over to the original equilibrium point. Okay. All right. Next free response question. Okay. This says include correct Libs diagrams. Okay. So it says Grainland currently produces wheat. What a good thing for Grainland to produce. Maybe that's why they named the country Grainland. Interesting. And they don't trade wheat in international markets. A says draw a correctly labeled demand and supply graph for the domestic wheat market. Label equilibrium price PE, equilibrium quantity QE. I'm going to pause the video and I'm going to do that. Okay, so Pretty easy here. It says draw a correct level graph. PE and QE are your equilibrium quantities. So it should look like that. That's not rocket science, right? So PE over to the y-axis, QE down to the x-axis. It'll look different here in a second. So B says the price of wheat in the world market is lower than the domestic price, and assume Grainland wants to trade wheat in the world market. So this says on your graph in part A, so don't draw a new graph. On your graph in part A, label the world market price PW and identify the domestic quantity demanded at PW as Q3 and the domestic quantity supplied of wheat as Q1. I'm not going to pause the video, but I'm going to do that. So you have a new price of PW. The quantity demanded is, what did it say, Q3? Yeah, Q3, and then Q1 is the quantity supplied. So that's what you should do. It should look like this, okay? You can see that, you can see PW, the world price is lower than the equilibrium price without trade. Q3 is dotted down to the x-axis, derived from where PW hits the demand curve. And Q1 is derived from where PW intersects with the supply curve, okay? So that's what it should look like, all right? Next question says, is Grainland going to import or export wheat? Your answer is they're going to import wheat. And the explanation should just be that the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. So citizens of Grainland want Q3, but domestically, they're only willing to, the domestic producers are only willing to be able to sell Q1. And so the people of Grainland are going to import Q3 minus Q1, all right? And again, the explanation is quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied. C, with the international trade of wheat, who will benefit in Grainland? Domestic producers, domestic consumers, neither or both, and explain. So we know that, and this is pretty intuitive, that with free trade, the consumer is going to benefit. It is intuitive, but we can also see it graphically, okay? So domestic consumer is going to increase because their consumer surplus increases. More people are willing to be able to buy it at the lower price, and those who are willing to be able to buy it at PE, at the original equilibrium price, are still buying it, but at a lower price. They have a greater consumer surplus, okay? Domestic producers are harmed by this, of course, because they're selling it at a lower price. Some firms are priced out of it completely, and the firms who remain are squeezed, right? Their producer surplus is squeezed because the price that they're able to sell it for drops from PE down to PW, okay? D, suppose that the government of Grainland decides to provide a subsidy for wheat farmers to make the country more competitive and sell wheat at the world market so that all wheat is produced domestically. So if they're providing a per unit subsidy to the point at which all wheat is produced domestically, that means they have to, so a per unit subsidy, so we just did excise tax in which the supply curve shifts to the left. Well, the per unit subsidy is the opposite, right? So it's going to shift the supply curve to the right. And if it's getting rid of all trade, that means that it's going to shift all the way to the point where the new supply intersects with that world price, intersects with the demand curve, which means we want Q3 at the price of PW. And if we don't get it at PW, domestically, then we're going to get it somewhere else. We're going to import it. And so if the government decides to provide a per unit subsidy to try and get all of our production to be in-house and not have us import anymore, that per unit subsidy has to lower the price all the way down to PW. So at that point, we are paying PW, and presumably there's a subsidy, which is going to be that vertical distance between your supply curves. And so the firms are able to recoup their losses. And so basically we are paying PW and the government's making up the difference to try and prop up domestic industry, okay? All right, hopefully all that made sense. That's it for Unit 2. Units 3 and 4 will be next. That's gonna be the product market, and that's definitely the bulk of microeconomics. Hey, have a great day, and I'll talk to you guys later.